Thank you very much, Simon. Good morning, everyone, and to all my colleagues around the continent. Not seeing you all in person this year, and we look forward to doing so again soon, hopefully next year. Also, morning to all my panelists. I'll shortly introduce each and every one of you. We've got a blockbuster lineup today, that's for sure. And but just to introduce the topic, at the moment, I think the global demand for high quality original content is at an all-time high. And that while that creates opportunities, it doesn't only create opportunities for creatives and for producers of those content, it also provides potential massive opportunities for governments around the world to look at what they can do to update their laws to make sure that they meet the challenges of the digital age. We know in Africa, most of the copyright legislations, prevalent copyright legislations require updating. It's in South Africa, we're in the process. Also, there's some developments in Nigeria and Kenya that we'll also speak about shortly. But one thing to understand is that we're dealing with a highly competitive global marketplace where countries have recognized the inherent value of attracting especially large-scale productions of quality creative content. And today, when we speak about copyright, it's a vast topic because you can speak about so many different areas. But we're going to focus our discussion today on the film and television production industries, which have shown globally to be capable of attracting massive investment and rather swiftly, and create tons of jobs in the process and so forth. So without further ado, let me introduce my panelists. I think I'll start by introducing Bradley Silva first because he got up earliest this morning there in New York. I think it's about 5:30 in the morning. Thank you for the early rise, Bradley, and for joining us. Bradley is the global head of IP policy over at Netflix. Bradley's also proudly South African, one of our finest exports to the US to date. And thank you for Bradley for joining us. We've also got Leon Ford, who's joining us from England. I think you'll have to tell us where, Leon. I remember it was a small town, but you certainly work with a big consultancy, one of the most prolific consultancy firms globally that track investments and production spend, especially in the film and television industry. Allsberg SPI, welcome, Leon. Bertrand Mullier is the Senior Advisor International Affairs of the International Federation of Film Producers, or FIAF. Bertrand, I believe, is joining us from hopefully a sunny London this morning. For a change, sunny, potentially. You're losing out on the weather there now, right? And then my colleagues, Uche, who's a partner at an intellectual property lawyer and expert at a Nigerian firm, Luka Oibode, and John Sekai, who's with Bowman's Kenya, also head of the IP unit there. So welcome, colleagues. So what we'll do for this discussion, I think, is to start with, let's call it an industry discussion to set the scene, and then we're going to move on to more of a legal discussion to look at some updates on developments in Kenya from where John hails, and then also from Nigeria from Uche, and I'll provide a short update on what's happening in South Africa. But I want us to also and our industry experts are also lawyers, some of them. I know Bradley and Bertrand. So we can have quite an informal dialogue. So if you want to at any point contribute something, to add something to a point raised, just raise your hand and hopefully I'll see it and I can tag you into the conversation. Because one of the questions that requires answering is, number one, is there really is Africa copyright ready for countries to tap into this enormous potential that the creative industries offer? And we'll come back to that question in a bit. But I think to start off our discussion, I'd like to invite Leon to tell us more about the economic argument for the industry. Like I mentioned, Leon's team over at Allsburg SPI have tracked production spending and investment in film sectors globally. And Leon's team produced a compelling report in 2020 on the potential benefits for post-pandemic economic recovery through investment into the film and TV industry. So, sorry, before we go to Leon, I do need to mention that Colin Dlamini, you would notice, is on the agenda. He called me this morning. He can unfortunately not attend this session. He has a personal emergency to deal with today. We wish him all the best. Colin is certainly one of the big champions of copyright in South Africa. He's the former chair of the Copyright Coalition, and it was largely due to his great efforts in South Africa that President Ramaphosa was persuaded, after engaging with industry, to refer the bills back, the Copyright Amendment Bill, to Parliament for further consideration. So all the best, Colin, and we look forward to him joining us at a future discussion. So Leon, over to you, and please don't forget to tell us remind me of that town that you hail from. It's a fascinating one. Thanks.
Sure, thanks. Hi again, Stephen, and hi to fellow panelists and everybody on the call. It's a fantastic event, and very pleased and grateful to be part of it. As Stephen mentioned, I'm based just north of London in a small town called Tring, but as we all have during the pandemic, have been working all over the world during that time, and I'd rather be in South Africa in person, but here we are. So as Stephen mentioned, I work with a company called Allsburg SPI. We're a firm of consultants that work globally and specialize in the screen sectors, mainly film and television, but some video games work as well. And across those sectors, we do a lot of strategy work for governments and their agencies, and a lot of private company work as well. And really, we've been witnessing the really unprecedented growth of production that Stephen describes. We call it the global production deluge. I mean, it's a really, we've never known a time like this in terms of the flow of investment into the sector on a global basis, and also the sort of ravenous appetite of consumers to see that content. I really want to just before we get started into the panel, just set the scene really with some with some numbers from the study that we mentioned in 2020 that looked at how this sector was growing and how this sector could contribute to recovery from the pandemic. So just to start with some numbers really, we did a very deep dive into building up a research model to do what really hadn't been done before, and show the global scale of investment going into film and television production. And this is looking at 2019, obviously before the pandemic. But what we found from that exercise was that we're looking at around 177, 180 billion US dollars in film and television spend in that year alone. And this doesn't include things like sports rights or commercials. This is just film, TV, documentaries. So it's a huge amount of spend flowing globally. In economic terms, that creates around 14 million jobs. And in gross value added terms, that equates to around 415 billion US dollars. The key point is that it's continuing to grow, and has continued to grow hugely over the pandemic. Obviously, the desire for content has only gone upwards in that time, and we've seen some data published over the summer that suggests in 2021 we're looking at around 220 billion in spend. So it's as a sector in the economy, film and TV production is a huge economic powerhouse. I mean, in the UK where I am, we're seeing the creative industries overall growing at a rate that's double the growth we're seeing in the wider UK economy. So it's a very significant economic driver. In 2019, again, staying in the UK, we saw film and TV production spend was one of the key reasons why the UK didn't go into recession for one of the quarters. So what we're seeing through our work globally is that governments if they haven't already, are looking very seriously at this sector in terms of, you know, its ability to provide economic returns, but also strategic growth potential and the ability to offer, you know, to offer growth in things like high skilled jobs, inward investment, and infrastructure growth. Just to pick up finally on that idea of this continuing, I mean, looking at the pandemic, obviously there were mass shutdowns, you know, because, you know, for obvious reasons production couldn't continue in many places for a time. But we've seen a very, very rapid return to production in many territories where it's possible, and a lot of governments have put in very strong and robust supports for this sector to enable it to return to delivering what it was before the pandemic. And actually, what we're starting to see now is as data comes out of countries, that the return to production in some cases is outstripping what was happening before the pandemic. Certainly in the UK, for example, the half-year figures for this year have been extremely strong, and it just underlines the importance of, you know, having a really good legislative structure around the industry, being able to allow it to grow and deliver what it's able to, because there is, as I say, you know, so much demand and so much investment flowing. So that's a quick kind of snapshot of what we're seeing and what the data is showing. And I'll pass back to Stephen, but, you know, happy to answer any questions on that.
Thank you, Leon. I've actually got a question for you already. One of the points in that 2020 report that I found very interesting and deeply compelling is that such a huge amount of production spend tends to find its way into other markets outside of the audiovisual services sector, like supporting industries. Can you tell us a little bit more about that? And I think that's an area where, when governments consider, like you say, start realizing the value of the film and television industries, that they start, the ones who recognize it first are the ones who recognize that it impacts so significantly on the broader economy, as large parts of production funding are spent in other sectors that support the productions. Can you tell us a little bit more about that, please?
Sure, yeah, thanks, Stephen. And just to mention, if you're interested in looking in more detail at the report I'm talking about, it's free to download on our website, o-sbi.com. But yes, the point you mentioned, Stephen, part of that study, we looked at the speed of production spend and also how that production spend moved into and around an economy. So the way we did that was to work with producers, and we accessed a number of actual film and television budgets, and then went through those budgets with the producers line item by line item to look at when the spend occurred, and also where, you know, in terms of the economy, which areas of the economy that spend was hitting. So first of all, just in terms of speed of impact, I mean, you know, as everyone will know, once a production starts up, there's a huge amount of spending that occurs. I mean, one of the examples in the report, we had access to a very high budget feature film budget, and you know, that was around $220 million, and it had a 16-week principal photography phase. And looking week by week at that, it was around $10 million being spent every 7 days into economy. And I think it's hard to think of another economic sector that can deliver that level of impact in that shorter time. And possibly the more compelling point that Stephen, you mentioned is how that spend moves around an economy. So we assigned each line item to an area of the economy, whether it was staying in the screen sector, so whether it was going to individuals or businesses that only operated in the screen sector, or whether it was flowing outside of the screen sector. And what we found across all the projects we looked at was a very similar picture, which is around 65-67% of film and TV budget spend was actually going out into the wider economy. And, you know, against the backdrop of the pandemic, it's really important that spend is, you know, it's hitting areas that have been really hit hard by COVID, you know, so thinking about transport, hospitality, catering, hotels, construction. So there's a really, we found a really kind of broad spread of that economic impact going outside the screen sector into, lots of parts of the economy. And the final point here is geographically as well. I mean, the spend, the spend is going all across a jurisdiction as well in many cases, depending on factors like location choice and where vendors are based. But there's a strong geographical impact as well, or a spread of geographical impact.
Thank you, Leon. Thank you very much. And we might come back with another question. It's so interesting, and it just shows how important this sector is, not only for the creative industries, but for so many other industries that support the productions. And the production spend has to happen, most of it at the beginning, to secure the accommodation and the traveling, and people spend money. And also there's tourism to think about. Successful productions. I read recently that 25% of people who tour to New Zealand, who are tourists to New Zealand, still cite the Lord of the Rings sites as one of the reasons they go there. Even Belfast, a lot of people go to Belfast to see the first Game of Thrones sites and spend about, I think in Belfast, I mentioned $300 million a year from tourism. That wouldn't have happened if those productions weren't there. So there's so many benefits. And Bradley, I want to bring you into the conversation now. If you could tell us a bit more, I think Netflix has changed the way that we watch television all around the world, and it's also changed the way in which original content, people want not just high quality content necessarily from their own countries, but they enjoy watching content produced in other countries as well. How well do you think Africa is positioned to tap into that market? How well is African content tracking on the Netflix platform, for instance? And if you can also let us know what kind of IP policy related concerns, or should I say aspects, are considered before Netflix makes decisions on where to actually invest substantially into new productions and partnering with local producers in the process. Thanks, Bradley.
Thanks, Stephen. Look, there's no question in my mind that there's a huge opportunity for creators from Africa to feed the global and local hunger for high quality, compelling original content. And this is an area that Netflix in particular has placed a lot of effort and resources behind. When we launched in South Africa in 2016, we were already beginning to lean quite hard into investing into original content outside of the US. And this year, we're making original content in more than 20 different countries, including South Africa and Nigeria. We're serving our local members in those two countries, as well as the more than 200 million members in 188 more countries around the world. So over the last 4 years, we've invested well over R1 billion in South African content. And now, at the moment, there are more than 80 licensed and Netflix commissioned South African shows on Netflix at the moment. And what you've seen in particular over the last 3 or 4 years is the potential for content to travel across language and cultural divides, not just succeeding in terms of their reach, but actually becoming really powerful drivers of conversation and connection between the viewer and the far off world that they're seeing on the screen. You mentioned these impacts on tourism, and those are definitely there, and our internal research is showing that connection and that affinity is real and is happening in relation to television content, not just big budget, grand big screen location-based productions, but with smaller shows as well. Now, internationally, and if you watch Netflix, some of these shows may be familiar to you. You've seen this travelability happen with hits like Lupin, Casa del Papel, or Money Heist, as you may know it as, or Call My Agent from France. These are incredible shows that actually had pretty amazing global success. And so really, we believe that fantastic content can come from anywhere. So the secret sauce, which actually isn't that secret because we tend to talk about this a lot, is to make sure that the content that's being created is authentic. And that means working really closely with local creators. So our approach is about forging strong connections with local creators, and internally as well, how we organize. We devote teams within the company to focus on specific countries, which is what we've done in South Africa and Sub-Saharan Africa in general. And what's great is that the kind of content that we're making in South Africa and more broadly is really first and foremost targeted to local audiences, because if the local audiences don't like it, it's probably not going to be perceived as authentic, right? So there has to be local impact. So it's not just like we're coming in and saying, well, let's make a South African show for a global audience, or let's go make a Spanish show that the whole world will like. We do want that to happen, but the first port of call is to make sure that people in Spain or people in South Africa don't feel like a global company is coming in from outside of their culture and making a show for a global audience. That's just not what makes a great show in our perspective. So this sort of investment takes a lot of time, right? Because it's about building trust, it's about building relationships, and it's about really supporting local creators, which is quite different from the Hollywood model of years past, where content is commissioned out of Los Angeles, right? Which has been seen and perceived as being more extractive in its approach to investment. I think we want to be the complete opposite of that, which is for us and those that follow in our footsteps to support the growth of the local sector, because without a strong and robust local sector, there can't be mutual success. It's integral for all of our success. We want to support and work with the best creators, the best writers, the best performers. We want to make sure that they want to work with us, and we want to support the emergence of the next generation of creators from the ground up. And there's plenty of room for other players in the market as well. This isn't a winner takes all approach. Netflix is actually a small piece of the pie when it comes to the actual and potential market for viewers. And so there's actually a lot of opportunity for other players to grow and thrive, and therefore for the local sector to benefit from that as well. So turning to the question of, so what is it about copyright policy or policies in general that are important to ensure that there's a clear runway to success? Well, I would say that what's key for us is to be able to work flexibly in the market, and that we don't want to be forced into a one-size-fits-all approach. Stephen, you spoke about the copyright industries being so different across the various different types of sectors. Well, within the film sector as well, of course, we know that what works for a documentary may not work for a comedy show, may not work for a drama, may not work for a series. And there can't be a one-size-fits-all approach when it comes to how these deals are done and how creators are able to work together. We have very strong incentives to provide creators with what they need, because if we don't do that, they're not going to want to work with us. So we want to make sure that we provide creators with creative freedom, fair remuneration, and of course the opportunity to leverage their work to reach a global audience and then go on to create more content, right? We want to build those relationships. So the legal framework at a high level has to enable that, can't inhibit that. What are the kinds of things that might inhibit that? Things like imposing restrictions on the acquisition of rights, or imposing specific, narrow, impractical, or stringent remuneration models on producers, because ultimately these are going to be counterproductive to what local producers need to grow and succeed. And if we can't have that happen, then I think we're not going to see success happen as well. I know that Bertrand will probably speak a bit more about, the types of elements that are needed in a copyright framework, but just to mention them briefly, and we've also discussed this in our presentation to Parliament on the copyright performers bills, is the importance of legislation that allows for consolidation of rights, contractual freedom, and certainty. And unfortunately, the bills, as we know, have a number of problematic elements in that regard. So just to close, I want to emphasize that the policy goals of ensuring that creators are well supported is 100% not in question. What is in question is the way of doing so, right? There needs to be a macro as well as a micro focus. Imposing a one-size-fits-all approach will be sure to stymie growth. It's going to reduce investments and reduce the potential for the audiovisual sector to support the economy. So when it comes to the need to address inequalities, that is 100% an important imperative. But one also needs to look at where the industry is, where it's going, and consider the impacts of any policy measures on future opportunities that can create a more inclusive and financially rewarding environment for those who had previously not enjoyed those benefits.
Fantastic. Thank you, Brad. You've mentioned so many key points there. Thank you very much for that. Bertrand, I'd like you to bring you into the conversation now to tell us more about, why is copyright important to producers? And also perhaps a little bit about FIAP's activities in Africa and how FIAP sees, the content production space in Africa progressing. Can it live up to its promise here? And as it does elsewhere? But why is copyright so important for producers to begin with?
Thank you, Stephen, and good morning, all. It's good to have colleagues here from Nigeria and Kenya. I'm really looking forward to hearing updates on what's happening in your respective countries, because there are very, very exciting developments there. Yeah, it's a pleasure to be here. I think perhaps, Stephen, to cut to the chase, it is vitally important for us to have copyright enabling frameworks that enable this very high-risk industry of film and television to operate with a reasonable degree of certainty and visibility. I think one key misconception we've found with policymakers, and I remember one historic meeting at the European Commission years ago, where the fonctionnaire, the civil servant who we're talking to, very well-educated person, practically fell off his chair when he learned that, no, we didn't go to a bank to have our film made and say, come on, give $2 million or $3 million. And then once that was made, we would then start engaging our rights in the marketplace. So we had to start from scratch and explain that very salient characteristic of the film and television content product cycle, that we engage our exclusive rights, those granted us through the national and international copyright framework, into the marketplace at project stage. So the whole investment cycle in our industry is speculation based. And elements such as, the script, the cast, of course, who's starring, the genre, the director's reputation, the production company's kind of track record, all these enter into the calculation that a distributor on the other side of the table will make in order to decide whether she is able and willing to put up a guarantee of a payment, no matter how badly or well the film will end up performing in her marketplace. So this mechanism, which is in evidence in international co-productions and straight pre-sales, is absolutely the lifeline. Yes, there are incentives and they're important. Yes, producers put their own working capital at risk in some projects. But we've looked at research from the European Audiovisual Observatory, looking at a region that's very active in audiovisual output. And fully between television broadcast license fees and other forms of pre-sales, the contribution to film production budgets in European film, on average, from the pre-sale of exclusive rights amounts to between 25 and 30% of budget. Good luck trying to close the budget on independent picture with that kind of gap in any other form of investment. The other point that a lot of policymakers have difficulties grappling with is that investment based on the speculative value of rights drive all the other categories of investment. So if you take a broadcast investment, if you take a package like Reika, which is a series that our colleagues at Quizzical Pictures are just finished. This is based on the financing for it was made possible by a very substantial advance from Fremantle Media in London over the value of the unsold territories, the as yet unlicensed territories that would be interested in pre-buying or buying this series. It's a classical 8 times 52 minutes. Then Mnet came in with their investment, which I don't know the detail of it, but I would vouch that it would consist in one aspect of it being the license fee, which is underwritten by the value of the transmission to the service in terms of aggregating advertising or subscription. But the rest of it would be an equity investment by the same company that is pegged on their perceived value of the sales of the rights to the unsold territory. So I'm sorry to get into the cuisine of it, and I hope I'm being clear enough, but it's very important to get policymakers and legislators to understand this catenation of exclusive rights and how they then drive any form of investment, other form of investment, be it equity or indeed debt. You can't get bank debt without collateral, and the collateral tends to be the distribution paper you've obtained from a local distributor, which you can then go and discount at the bank and put into your production budget. The other thing I would say is policymakers, as a general trend worldwide, have a tendency to compress the issues that pertain to several different types of creative industries into a kind of compound copyright regulatory solution. I'm using large quotes here, which tend to prove more generative of problems than of actual solutions. And it's often based on the confusion between the primary and secondary rights. What I've described as a model for financing our content relies on our engaging the value of primary rights, aggregated in the legal person of the producer, and it's back to the principle that Bradley in particular evoked, in order to leverage finance. If you take, for example, Senegalese copyright law, Article 100 grants all broadcasters, commercial and public, a statutory license for the communication to the public other than on the internet. So that means that instead of having face-to-face value-based negotiations for each film that the Senegalese may make in the local language, the minute they release it on DVD or on VCD, that's it. The broadcasters can pick it up, and all they have to do is put 4% of their annual budget into a CMO, and the producers will get remunerated in this way. And that what it does is it withdraws a potential primary market, which could drive local content investment in very interesting ways, especially in the case of a country like Senegal, that speaks a language that has quite a small footprint in the West African region. So that's an interesting point to consider. And finally, I'll say that policymakers at the moment have a tendency to overreach in intervening in what should be really the purview of industrial relations inside the business. And Bradley's evoked this very ably earlier on, so I won't linger on it. But we think, first of all, that a well-functioning film and TV content industry has to be based on good, flexible, and fair remunerative practices for all involved. And I stress all involved. And the tendency today is to fetishize the plight only specific categories of participants in the creative endeavor that film as a collective work is, namely authors and performers, and to then impose on us remunerative systems that actually will produce more perverse effects than they will resolve issues, typically by saying, in the case of the South African draft law we're considering, you can only have a system of remuneration based on gross royalty, which of course may impact the upfront remuneration of performers, for example, or authors in very negative ways. You cannot base, as I said to the PCTI a few weeks ago, a remunerative system on the few hits that our business generates. Shaka Zulu and District 9 are no pointers to the way things should be regulated for. Finally, I think in terms of Africa, is Africa copyright ready? I think it is. And I think the international streamers and the national operators, such as Mnet, which is in fact Pan-African, are driving demand for content of professional quality. Reika is the case in point. It's an international co-production, if you wish. And that the huge asset currently, in particular South Africa, apart from great locations and a very strong studio infrastructure, is that the cost of making a series like Reika is far more competitive than you would make it for the same level of production values if you were working with the BBC in Europe or ITV or ZDF or France Télévisions. So yes, and I think the demand is driving a demand from the producers to be more acutely aware of what copyright law can do for them, to understand the importance of chain of title in particular as a premise to dealing and license their content at home and all over the world.
Thank you very much, Bertrand. It's you know, copyright is what the producers have to leverage for that finance, to secure the finance for the productions. And if a point that I found that that in local debates on the bills was also misunderstood. It's like Bradley was mentioning earlier. You can't have an approach that seeks to paint with a broad brush across all industries, but in the film industry alone, it shows how diverse that industry is, and no single project is identical to another. Each one, contractual flexibility is so important. So in South Africa, we certainly have a bill that falls flat on most of those principles that both of you mentioned. Legal certainty on key areas. We haven't spoken about enforcement yet, but unfortunately, in the South African bill, there's still no remedy for rights holders to act against foreign infringers who infringe rights online, who don't own assets in South Africa. We've seen site blocking and dynamic injunctions used successfully in a number of countries around the world to assist with that, the scourge of online infringements. So some much more work needs to be done in South Africa. Fortunately, the bill is with the portfolio committee. They'll probably continue their deliberations after the local government elections here in November. And both of you, Bertrand and Bradley, you presented brilliantly during the recent public hearings to actually illuminate these specific issues. And so, right, let's get these updates from Kenya and also Nigeria. Uche, we respect the ladies first rule on this panel and elsewhere. So we'll invite you to start. And if you can let us know what's going on. We know there's a bit of confusion as we have two bills in Parliament. Tell us more, and also tell us whether you think, from having looked at the text of those bills, you know, is it headed in the right direction to address some of these concerns? Because Nigeria, as we know, you know, Nollywood is one of the film production centers in Africa and around the world. So it's important to get it right for more investment into that sector. Over to you, Uche.
Thank you so much. You know, I'm happy that you mentioned Nollywood because it's actually #2 in the world next to India, only in terms of production. It produces about 2,500 movies annually. And so that's a huge plus for Nigeria. Okay, as a first off on the law, you rightly mentioned we have two bills. First, the Nigerian, the law that is responsible for copyright in Nigeria is the Copyright Act of 1970, amended in 1999. So as you can see, it's overdue for repeal, and then it's really outdated. And that necessitated having two bills, conflicting bills, awaiting the presidential assent. One is the NCC, Nigerian Copyright Commission, which is the agency responsible for copyright work. The executive bill has not been passed. And then there's recently a private member bill that is being pushed by a senator. So, and we all know that executive bill and the private member bill usually wouldn't have much power. So my worry is why we have two conflicting bills instead of putting all our resources and our efforts together to push one through. So if you ask me whether the Nigeria creates an environment for copyright to thrive in the digital age, I will say they'll be able to thrive. But recently there was the NBC, Nigerian Broadcasting Commission, came up with an amended code, and this code kind of takes away from the right of a right owner to license, freedom to license. And with that, it created a lot of negative buzz. And recently in a webinar, the stakeholders were able to face the NBC board boss face to face, and we do understand now that the matter has been taken back to the presidency. That shows that at least they want to have a say and maybe to do something to that code, because it really slaps Nigeria on the face. And in the light of the ease of doing business, how would you attract foreign investments if you don't allow creatives to really enjoy the benefit of their work or the successes, and then you force them to license or give excessive power to the NBC to freely license somebody's work. So that is still on the pipeline. So, and it really beats me that Nigeria does not see protection of copyright and the work of these creatives as priority, despite the huge revenue that comes. I'm sorry to put Bradley on this spot, but we read a report that Netflix paid about $3.8 million for the blockbuster Lionheart to get the global license. You can plead the fifth, so I'm not going to ask you to really respond. But when I was doing my research, those are the things that I came up with. So blockbusters like Lionheart, The Wedding Party, Namaste Wahala, and all of those are, even the Namaste Wahala is a collaboration between the Bollywood, the Indian film industry, and Nollywood. So that kind of creates economic value to a region. So you could see that Nigeria is really placed in the limelight, to compete globally with the likes of Hollywood. Even Hollywood is tapping from our talents. Davido was in the Coming to America too, and David Oyelowo was in Selma, where he excellently portrayed Martin Luther King Jr. And then Cynthia Erivo had been tipped. She narrowly missed EGOT, which is when somebody in a particular year wins the award, Emmy, Grammy Award, Oscar, and Tony Award. She would have been the youngest, and then she would have shared limelight with Whoopi and John Legend. So that tells you where Nigeria is going with all of these creatives. There's a lot of work being done. There's a lot of opportunities, but is our government really ready, or the laws ready really to protect? Because the importance of copyright law is to protect and the work of a right owner. And no company will want to invest in a work that is not properly protected, because there will be no return on investment. How do you encourage the young talents to continue to produce if they can't, if they are unable to pay the loan? One of the speakers respectfully mentioned that you can't really go to the bank and tell them, because you are about producing this, then can give you tons of millions of money. They can't do that. So you need to really thrive in an economy where protection is seen to be very adequate. And I don't think in Africa that we are there yet. We are getting there. Recently, Wizkid, his ticket sold up in London. He was about performing in London, and within 12 minutes, all of this money can find its way back to Nigeria when you pay taxes. There are corporate taxes, there are individual taxes. So the government must, in coming up with policies and the need to protect, know that the money that you really get from protection of intellectual property is really huge. And in this day of COVID and people are locked down at home, there's nothing to do but entertainment. And thanks to Netflix for keeping So that's in terms of it from Nigeria. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Uche. And it's interesting if one considers those two bills that you mentioned. The private members bill that was introduced in May seems to have been developed earlier in time. Oh no, sorry. It's actually the bill that was introduced in the National Assembly recently July. Seems to be a copy of the text of the 2015 bill, and that bill contains a similar provision to a provision in the South African Copyright Bill, which is causing huge concerns of a so-called a general contract override provision that says you can't contract out of any benefits that this act will give you. Now, contract override provisions are not unusual, but wherever they appear, for instance, in UK law, they are very limited application to address specific issues. It severely curtails contractual freedoms if you say you cannot waive rights that are afforded to you, even though it sounds good in practice. It's not a good thing. But I also noted from the private members bill that it was quite a progressive, quite a modern approach in some ways, and even suggested online enforcement mechanisms such as site blocking and so forth, which will require a bit of refinement, because any such a powerful remedy like that would require refinement. But it was still interesting to see that it is included there, and that the persons who put together the private members bill clearly recognize that something needs to be done with online enforcement. John, can we? I saw you nodding there when I mentioned the contract override provision. That I assume you like it as little as I do. Tell us more. Tell us more about the situation in Kenya and any developments, and whether you think Kenya is rising up to the challenge, to safeguard intellectual property rights and copyright in particular. Thank you.
Thanks, Stephen, for that, and to my fellow panelists for very elucid overviews on what's going on. I think on the Kenyan side, I just wanted to maybe start by just saying that recently, I think a few months ago, towards the end of December, the government, through the Ministry of ICT, published a national draft film policy, which is meant to crystallize the Kenya government's policy around investment in this particular sector. They've appreciated its importance to the growth of the economy in this country. And as a very interesting thing is that at the preamble, the policy says very clearly that there is a clear gap with respect to our legal policy and regulatory framework in the country in terms of encouraging the growth of the industry. And so the purpose of this policy is to make sure that all those issues and gaps are addressed. And obviously, this then leads to various issues around the various organizations, regulatory agencies that are involved in this industry. You have the Copyright Board of Kenya that deals with copyright, which is very important for creatives and also for those who, institutions or entities like Netflix, Mnet, who commercialize those rights, working with the creatives. You have the Kenya Film Commission Board, which polices or takes care of the kind of content that's being shown to Kenyans. And then you also have the Communications Authority that comes in with its rules around local content requirements. We've got a 40% local content requirement in Kenya for broadcast to Kenyans, and also the issues around age gating and thresholds around what time people can watch certain content within the market. So all these organizations, all these entities are involved in this space. There is some conflicts between them. But the biggest problem that we have really at the end of the day is the issue around enforcement of rights. And that then is linked to who are the parties, who are the bodies that enforce these rights at the end of the day, because it's one thing to have all these laws in place, but are the rights capable of enforcement? So in that regard, I'll just take us back. 2019, the Copyright Act of Kenya was amended to try and bring it in line with modern copyright laws, because a lot of content is now being distributed digitally, as we all know, and the biggest players are now, I think, digital video on demand or over-the-top providers of content. And the amendments to that particular law was to introduce a new mechanism for enforcement, which is takedown notices. Previously, one had to go to court to get this kind of orders, but now under the Copyright Act, you can issue a takedown notice to an infringer or to a party that's carrying infringing content and require them to take down that content within 48 hours of receipt. Obviously, there's a counter notice requirement there, so a content publisher can challenge that takedown notice, and then there's a way in which one can go to court and try and enforce that. I think the takedown notice mechanism has been received fairly well in the market. The only issues that have arisen have been the fight back by internet service providers around their liability around the infringing content, if and what role they play. Of course, the issues around safe harbor provisions, saying that they are not supposed to police the kind of content that's out there. Their work is they're just providing a medium where the content is carried, and they shouldn't be held liable for infringing content. Is an issue that hasn't been clearly addressed in the law. And I see a situation where our Kenyan courts are probably going to get to wade into that and strike down some of the provisions in our Corporate Act. And for me, that's the biggest issue, is that we are not looking at some of these issues holistically, and the Kenyan courts, unfortunately, sometimes apply basic analysis of legal principles and end up striking out a lot of useful legislation instead of developing it further. And that's probably going to be an issue that we'll face. I know currently last year there were a couple of takedown notices issued, and there was a matter that went to the Kenyan court, and that Kenyan court actually issued a stay order on the takedown notices, and the matter is now pending in court. So that just leads to what I was just saying, which is that the courts will probably be involved in that process. Beyond that, on the copyright scene, there have been amendments around the kind of penalties one can face if you infringe copyright. That has been doubled. It's now $10,000. It used to be very minimal, $4,000 or so. I still think that there's perhaps need for stronger deterrent penalties in that space. Otherwise, because as we know, a lot of the infringing material is being copied and run at large scale, and a $10,000 fine might not be deterrent, and would not be as deterrent as it should be. Then the other point I wanted to raise was, and which is very interesting for the film industry, and if this works out, is we've got a Movable Securities Act now that was passed into law. And part of it, one of the things that it provides for is the use of intellectual property as collateral. And that means that some of the IP rights, for instance, this copyright, the distribution agreements in film financing, that can be used for film financing. I know of a couple of transactions happening, not in Kenya, but in Mauritius, but looking at some Kenyan works. And there's a potential that they will probably use some of the works that have been registered here, or that have been created here as part of the collateral for their financing. So that might come into Kenya as well. And I think to close, I think Kenya has some useful developments that they're making, but there's still a lot of need for harmonization, and there's probably going to be a lot of need from all the players in play, including the regulators in place, especially the Kenya Corporate Board, to assist the process. The point that Stephen made around stepping into contractual agreements between parties and the issues around clearance of rights is an issue that we have seen over the past couple of years. It's a headache for a lot of parties doing these deals in this market, because sometimes the regulator tries to wade into those transactions, especially if one of the parties goes and says that their rights are being stolen from them or being taken away from them. Yet it's a contractual agreement where you are assigning certain rights. You can waive your economic rights. You can agree to certain things, but then the regulator seeks to step in and say that, you can't do this, you can't do that. Yet the law is very clear. We are party to the Berne Convention. Our Copyright Act allows for treatment of commercial rights in this sense. But we have that problem where the regulator seeks to try and play the middleman and pander to the public perception around the rights of Kenyans in that sense. But I think overall, we are going somewhere with it, but then with corporate protection and with setting up this industry in Kenya, but there's still a long way to go. Thanks.
Wonderful. Stephen. Wonderful. Thank you, John. And thank you to all of my panelists. We unfortunately won't have time to take any questions from the audience today, but I guess they can be sent through by email and we can respond like that. I think in summary, we can just say that this industry is almost a low-hanging fruit for securing massive inward investment into a country. And it's something that governments in Africa should look at. What is their infrastructure like? Can they actually attend to these productions? Because copyright is not the only aspect. It's I think Bertrand mentioned that too. You've also got to look at appropriate and effective tax rebate and incentive systems to bring the high-level investments. But copyright is where it starts. And if producers can control their rights, local producers can also go into co-production agreements with the likes of Netflix and other parties and explore different rights models. So the landscape has changed, but there's exciting opportunities, and it's very important that governments understand the value of the industry and what it can do to position itself to attract more of a share of this global share of investment, and also engage with producers and local stakeholders before starting to draft the bill, to make sure that eventually do your economic impact assessments and make sure that when you start drafting a bill, it's fit for purpose and one that will secure that investment. So we've got to sign off, but I want to thank each and every one of my superstar panelists for their brilliant contributions. It's been an honor to share this panel with you, and go well, and I hope to see you all sometime soon. Same time next week.
Thank you, as usual. Thank you very much.
Thank you, everyone.